He expected a black-edged letter within the year, a tidy and final accounting for the unfortunate matter of his wife. He had paid her desperate uncle a small fortune to take her off his hands, a sickly, pale creature with the unfortunate name of Alara, and had installed her in the most remote, inhospitable of his properties, a rotting tooth of an estate on the storm-lashed northern coast, with the implicit understanding that she would quietly fade away. He did not expect to return 2 years later, broken from a war he had not wanted to fight, seeking only the silence of grave, and find the gates of Blackwood Manor repaired and its chimneys breathing smoke. He did not expect to find the ledgers balanced, the fields productive, and the staff fiercely loyal to a woman they no longer called the dying bride. He certainly did not expect to find his ghost of a wife, stained with ink and mud, more alive than anyone he had ever known, ruling a small, thriving kingdom she had carved from the heart of his neglect. He had banished her to a tomb, but she had built a fortress, and he, the Duke of Blackwood, was now the intruder knocking at its gates. The solicitor's office was a study in shades of gray. The dust motes dancing in the thin shafts of London light were gray. The stone of the fireplace was gray, and the face of Mr. Pettigrew, a man who seemed to have been born middle-aged and disappointed, was the gray of old parchment. Alastair, the 9th Duke of Blackwood, felt a kinship with the room. He, too, felt composed of nothing but shades of gray. His duty was a gray weight, his future a gray fog, his heart a lump of gray, cold stone. He had returned from the continent not with laurels, but with a profound and soul-deep weariness, the kind that settled in the bones and soured the taste of wine. The war had ended, but the noise of it still echoed in the hollow spaces inside him. Now there was this, another duty, another transaction. Across the mahogany desk, a girl sat beside her uncle. She was the final piece of a political bargain he had neither sought nor desired, a loose end from a failed alliance his father had brokered years ago. Her name was Alara Vance. Her uncle, a portly man with sweating palms and eyes that darted about the room like frightened mice, had been reciting her virtues for the past hour. Virtues Alastair had no use for. She was, according to the uncle, of gentle birth, though her family was now utterly bankrupt. She was accomplished in watercolors and the pianoforte, skills that would find little purchase in the life Alastair envisioned for her. The uncle conveniently omitted the most salient fact, the one that made this whole, sordid affair possible. She was sickly. A consumptive cough, the doctors had whispered. A fragile constitution. She would not. The consensus was, see another 2 winters. Alastair looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time. She was as gray as the room. Her dress was a washed-out gray, mended at the cuffs. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched thin over delicate bones. A fine tremor ran through her hands, which were clenched tightly in her lap. The only color about her was the startling, lucid green of her eyes and a faint, unhealthy flush high on her cheekbones. She had not spoken a word since entering the room. She simply sat, straight-backed and silent, her gaze fixed on a point somewhere over his left shoulder. He had the unsettling feeling that she was not looking at the wall, but through it, into the cold, empty future that awaited them both. He felt a flicker of something. Not pity, he was incapable of that, but a cold, clinical acknowledgement. She was a problem to be managed, a life to be tidily concluded. The terms are acceptable, Alastair said, his voice a low rasp. It felt unused, rusty. He had spoken little since his return. The dowry, or what remains of it, will be settled. Her debts will be cleared. The marriage will take place tomorrow by special license. The uncle, whose name Alastair had already forgotten, practically vibrated with relief. Your grace is most generous, most benevolent. Alara, thank the Duke. The girl's head turned, and for a moment, her lucid green eyes met his. There was no gratitude in them. There was no fear. There was a shocking, unnerving emptiness, a placid sea over an immeasurable depth of something he could not name. It was the look of someone who had already lost everything and was now merely observing the final, tedious paperwork of her own demise. "There is no need for thanks," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried a strange resonance, like a bell rung underwater. It was clear, without the reedy thinness he had expected from someone so frail. "This is not a kindness. It is a transaction. I am a debt being settled. Let us not pretend otherwise." Alistair felt a muscle jump in his jaw. The bluntness was unexpected. It was the first interesting thing that had happened all day. The uncle sputtered, his face turning a blotchy red, but Alistair raised a hand to silence him. "Miss Vance is correct," he said, his gaze locked with hers. "It is a transaction, and, as the purchasing party, I have one further condition." He leaned forward slightly, the leather of his chair groaning in the quiet room. "You will reside at my northern estate, Blackwood Manor." The name fell into the room like a stone into a well. He saw the solicitor, Mr. Pettigrew, flinch. Even the odious uncle seemed to pale. Blackwood Manor was a name spoken in whispers, a place of ill repute, a monument to decay. It had not been properly inhabited in a century. It was isolated, windswept, and rumored to be sinking back into the marshland from which it had been built. It was, in short, the perfect place to send someone to die. He was offering her a tomb. He knew it. She knew it. For a long moment, she simply stared at him, her expression unreadable. He expected a protest, tears, a plea for mercy. He had steeled himself against it. He did not expect the slow, faint curve of her lips. It was not a smile. It was something far more unnerving. It was an acknowledgement, an acceptance of the unvarnished truth of their bargain. "As your grace wishes," she said, her voice perfectly even. "A tomb by any other name. It makes little difference to me." And with that, she turned her gaze back to the wall, dismissing him as completely as if he had ceased to exist. Alistair found himself strangely unsettled. He had expected to be purchasing a victim. He was beginning to suspect he had acquired something else entirely. The thought was a brief, sharp splinter under the thick callus of his indifference. He dismissed it. She was a temporary inconvenience, a ghost he would pay to house until she had the decency to disappear. Alara felt the weight of his gaze, a physical pressure. The Duke of Blackwood. He was nothing like the whispered rumors. The rumors spoke of a hero, a brilliant strategist. The man before her was a husk. His face was all sharp angles and shadows, his eyes the color of a winter sky just before a storm, holding a vast and terrible emptiness. He looked like a man who had seen the end of the world and had not been impressed. She had thought herself numb, hollowed out by sickness, poverty, and the suffocating pity of her relatives. But looking at him, she felt a flicker of kinship. He was a ruin just like her, a grander, more imposing ruin, but a ruin nonetheless. His decree of banishment to Blackwood Manor had barely registered. London, with its choking fog and grasping relatives, had been a prison. A remote, decaying house sounded less like a punishment and more like a reprieve. A quiet place to finish the business of dying. Her uncle's panicked hiss beside her was a distant buzzing. All she could focus on was the Duke's eyes. They were not cruel. Cruelty required passion, and this man was a vessel of pure, cold apathy. He was not sending her away to hurt her. He was sending her away so he would not have to look at her, think of her, or be burdened by her existence. It was a practical solution to an inconvenient problem. She could appreciate that. Pragmatism was a language she understood. It was the language of turning a dress for the third time, of making a single loaf of bread last a week, of measuring out medicine drop by drop to make it last. He was discarding her, and in the strange, lucid clarity that her illness sometimes afforded her, she found she did not mind. Being discarded meant being left alone, and being left alone was the only thing she had dared to hope for. The wedding, the next day, was a perfunctory affair in a cold, empty church. 2 witnesses dragged in off the street, a vicar who smelled of mothballs and sherry. Alistair stood beside her, a silent, imposing statue in black. He spoke his vows in a monotone, the words falling dead in the chilled air. When it was her turn, Alara's voice, though quiet, did not tremble. She was promising to honor and obey a man who was exiling her. The irony was so profound it was almost funny. When the vicar pronounced them man and wife, there was an awkward pause. Alistair did not move. He did not touch her. He simply turned and walked away, leaving her standing at the altar. The transaction was complete. She was now the Duchess of Blackwood, a duchess of dust and decay. The carriage that collected her was as black and severe as the Duke himself. Her meager belongings, a single, battered trunk containing a few worn dresses and a handful of books, were strapped to the back. Her uncle saw her off, pressing a damp, clammy hand into hers. "You have done your duty to the family, Ilara," he whispered, his eyes avoiding hers. "Be a good wife." She pulled her hand away. "I'm no longer your concern," she said, and the words felt like liberation. She climbed into the carriage without a backward glance. The door shut with a heavy, final thud. Inside, the leather seats were cold and cracked. The air smelled of dust and disuse. She did not know how long the journey would take. Days, perhaps a week. It did not matter. For the first time in years, she was moving toward a destination of her own, even if that destination was a grave. She leaned her head against the cold glass of the window and watched London, a city that had never been her home, dissolve into the gray mist. The journey north was a long, silent penance. The carriage swayed and jolted over rutted roads, each lurch a fresh insult to her aching bones. Rain began to fall on the second day, a relentless, weeping drizzle that turned the world outside the carriage window into a smear of gray and brown. The landscape grew bleaker, the trees more skeletal, the villages farther apart. The air grew colder, seeping through the cracks in the carriage frame, a damp chill that settled deep in her lungs and ignited the familiar, treacherous fire of her cough. Alistair rode alongside the carriage on a massive black charger, a solitary figure wrapped in a heavy cloak. He never spoke to her. At the coaching inns where they stopped for the night, he would take a separate room, leaving instructions for her meal to be brought to hers. He was a ghost haunting the periphery of her journey. She would catch glimpses of him through a rain-streaked window, standing alone in the inn yard, his shoulders slumped, staring into the gathering dark. He looked like a man carrying an impossible weight. She wondered what ghosts haunted him, what battles he was still fighting in the silence of his own mind. She spent the long hours in the carriage reading. The books were her only companions, a worn volume of Seneca, a collection of botanical prints, a book of household accounts she had salvaged from her father's library. She read not for pleasure, but for anchor. The words were solid things in a world that was dissolving around her. They were a reminder of order, of logic, of a world that made sense. On the fifth day, the landscape changed again. The rolling hills flattened into desolate marshland, vast and empty under a low, bruised sky. The air grew thick with the smell of salt and damp earth, of decay. The road became a narrow causeway, a muddy track winding through reeds and stagnant pools of water. In the distance, silhouetted against the churning gray sea, she saw it. Blackwood Manor. It was not a house. It was a carcass, a great, sprawling beast of gray stone, slumped and broken-backed against the horizon. One wing had partially collapsed, its roof gaping open to the sky like a silent scream. The windows were dark, vacant eyes, many of them boarded over. Ivy, thick as a man's arm, crawled over the walls, a choking green tide that seemed to be actively pulling the stones apart. The grounds were a wilderness of tangled thorns and skeletal trees, their branches clawing at the sky. The place did not look neglected. It looked cursed. It radiated a profound and ancient misery. The carriage lurched to a halt before a pair of immense, wrought-iron gates, rusted shut and festooned with weeds. Alistair dismounted, his boots sinking into the mud. He had not tried the gates. He simply stood there, looking at the house, his face a mask of grim satisfaction. This was it, the end of the line, the place he had chosen for her. A figure emerged from a small, crooked gatehouse, a stooped old man with a face like a shriveled apple. He shuffled forward, pulling at a forelock of white hair. "Your Grace," he mumbled, his voice hoarse with disuse. "Open the main gates, Croft," Alistair commanded. His voice was flat, devoid of any emotion. The old man fumbled with a huge, rusty key. The lock groaned in protest, but finally gave way. The gates swung inward with a screech of tortured metal, opening onto a long, weed-choked drive. The carriage rolled through, its wheels crunching on the gravel. As they drew closer, the scale of the decay became even more apparent. The stone was stained black with damp, and a greenish slime coated the lower walls. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and wet rot. The carriage stopped before the main entrance, a set of massive oak doors studded with iron. The doors remained closed. There was no one to greet them. The house was as silent as a tomb. Alistair dismounted and came to the carriage door, opening it. He did not offer her a hand. He simply stood back, his expression unreadable. "Welcome to your new home, Your Grace," he said, the title a deliberate, mocking cruelty. Alara gathered her shawl around her shoulders and prepared to step out. The first blast of wind hit her like a physical blow, cold and wet, carrying the raw smell of the sea. It stole the air from her lungs and sent a shudder through her entire body. She took a breath, then another, forcing the air into her protesting lungs. She would not show weakness. Not now. Not in front of him. She stepped down from the carriage, her thin shoes sinking immediately into the sodden gravel. The rain, which had been a drizzle, now began to fall in earnest, cold and hard. It plastered her hair to her scalp and soaked through the thin wool of her dress in seconds. She stood there, shivering in the mud and the rain, and looked up at the monstrous, decaying pile of stone that was to be her home, her prison, her grave. Alistair watched her, his face impassive. He saw the tremor that ran through her, the way she hugged the thin shawl to her body. A flicker of something, a memory of a shivering soldier dying in the mud of a battlefield, moved behind his eyes, but he crushed it. This was necessary. It was the only way to be free. "The staff are aware of your arrival," he said, his voice clipped. "They will see to your needs." He turned away from her, moving toward his horse. He was not staying. He was leaving her here. "Now, Your Grace," a sharp, disapproving voice cut through the sound of the rain. A woman stood in the now-open doorway of the house. She was tall and severe, dressed in black bombazine, her gray hair pulled back into a tight, unforgiving bun. Her face was a mask of pinched disapproval. This, Alara surmised, must be the housekeeper. "Mistress Croft." Alistair acknowledged her with a curt nod. "The Duchess will be residing here. See that she is made comfortable." The word comfortable was so ludicrous in this setting that it bordered on black humor. The housekeeper's gaze flickered over Alara, a swift, dismissive appraisal that took in the cheap dress, the pale face, the shivering frame. Contempt radiated from her in waves. "As you wish, Your Grace," she said, her tone making it clear she wished nothing of the sort. Alistair swung himself up onto his horse. He did not look at Alara. He looked at the house, at the gray, weeping sky. "I have business in the north," he said to no one in particular. "I will not be returning." It was not an explanation. It was a verdict. He turned his horse, the animal's hooves churning the mud. He did not look back. He did not offer a word of farewell. He simply rode away, a black shape receding down the long, dark tunnel of the drive, until he was swallowed by the rain and the mist. Alara was left alone, standing in the pouring rain, in the shadow of a dying house, with a hostile housekeeper and the ghost of a husband who had just sentenced her to a slow, quiet death. The cold was absolute. It was in the air, in the mud, in the stones of the house. It seeped into her bones, a final, chilling embrace. For a moment, a wave of utter desolation washed over her, so vast and so total that she thought it might drown her right there in the gravel drive. She felt her knees weaken, her vision swim. This was it. This was the end. But then, something else stirred within her. A small, hard kernel of defiance. He had left her here to die. He expected her to be a ghost, to fade away quietly and without fuss. He had looked at her and seen nothing but a fragile, broken thing. She straightened her shoulders. She lifted her chin. The rain ran down her face like tears, but her eyes were dry and burning. She looked at the hostile housekeeper, who was still standing in the doorway, a smug, vulture-like patience on her face. "Well," Alara's voice was surprisingly strong, cutting through the wind. "Are you going to leave me to drown out here, or will you show me my room?" The housekeeper's eyes widened in surprise. She had clearly expected weeping, or perhaps a Leda-like swoon. She had not expected a command. For a moment, the two women stood locked in a silent battle of wills, the rain lashing down around them. Then, with a sniff of disapproval, the housekeeper turned and swept back into the house. Alara took a deep breath of the cold, wet air. It burned her lungs, but it also felt strangely cleansing. She took a step, and then another, her muddy shoes leaving a trail on the stone steps. She walked out of the rain and into the suffocating darkness of Blackwood Manor. She had been abandoned, but she was not dead yet. The inside of the house was even more oppressive than the outside. The air was thick and stagnant, heavy with the smell of damp stone, cold ash, and something else, something cloying and sweet, the scent of decay. A vast, cavernous hall rose up into shadows, its ceiling lost in darkness. Portraits of grim-faced ancestors, their faces obscured by grime and their canvases warped by damp, stared down from the walls. Furniture lay shrouded in white cloths, like corpses awaiting burial. The silence was absolute, broken only by the drip, drip, drip of water from a dozen unseen leaks. Mistress Croft led her up a grand, sweeping staircase, the marble steps slick with a fine layer of green algae. The housekeeper did not speak, her disapproval a palpable force field around her. She moved through the house with a proprietary air, the queen of this kingdom of rot. Alara followed, her hand trailing on the cold, damp stone of the balustrade. Every step was an effort. The chill of her wet clothes had seeped deep into her body, and the familiar, exhausting ache was beginning to build in her chest. They passed down a long gallery, its windows boarded over, plunging the space into a tomb-like gloom. The few shafts of light that penetrated the cracks illuminated swirling clouds of dust. Alara could feel the house actively fighting against her. The cold, the damp, the darkness, they were not passive states. They were weapons designed to wear down the spirit and break the will. This was not a house. It was a predator. Finally, the housekeeper stopped before a heavy oak door at the end of a deserted wing. "This will be your room," she announced, her voice flat. She pushed the door open. The room was vast, cold, and funereal. A huge, four-poster bed dominated the space, its dark wood heavily carved with morbid scenes of hunts and battles. The hangings were of a dark, heavy velvet that had long since faded to a dusty purple, and they smelled of mildew. A single, tall window, its glass clouded with grime, looked out over the desolate marshland. There was a fireplace, but the grate was filled with a mound of old, cold ash. The room was a perfect, self-contained tomb. It was the room of a woman who was not expected to leave it. "Your trunk will be brought up," Mistress Croft said, her hand already on the doorknob, eager to depart. "Dinner is at 7. A tray will be brought. The Duke prefers his household to be quiet." "The Duke is not here," Alara stated, her voice quiet but firm. The housekeeper's lips thinned into a bloodless line. "His Grace's ways are the ways of this house." She paused, her eyes narrowing. "You're ill. The journey has been long. I suggest you rest." It was not a suggestion. It was a command disguised as concern. It meant, lie down and die. Be the invalid everyone expects you to be. With a final, withering look, she pulled the door shut, the sound of the heavy latch clicking into place echoing in the vast, cold room. Alara was alone. The exhaustion she had been holding at bay crashed over her. Her legs felt weak as water. She stumbled to the bed, her hand brushing against the velvet hangings. They felt cold and slightly sticky to the touch. She sank onto the edge of the mattress, which sagged alarmingly under her slight weight. The damp cold of the room was relentless. It was a living thing, crawling over her skin, seeping into her marrow. Her cough, which had been a low grumble, now erupted, a racking, painful spasm that bent her double and left her breathless and dizzy. This was her lowest point, lower than the poverty, lower than the pity, lower than the cold transaction in the solicitor's office. This was a deliberate, calculated cruelty. She had been placed in a room designed to kill her. The damp would settle in her lungs. The cold would sap her strength. The isolation would break her spirit. He had not simply abandoned her. He had engineered her death. She lay back on the bed, her wet clothes clinging to her, and stared up at the canopy, lost in shadows. It would be so easy to give in, so easy to close her eyes, to let the cold take her, to simply stop, to become the ghost everyone expected. For a long, timeless moment, she considered it. The sheer effort of living, of breathing, of fighting, seemed insurmountable. The silence of the house pressed in, whispering of the sweet, final peace of surrender. But as she lay there, shivering in the dark, something else began to burn alongside the cold. It was anger, a white-hot, furious anger that was so pure and so potent it felt like a jolt of life. He had underestimated her. They had all underestimated her. They had looked at her pale face and her slender frame and seen only weakness. They had not seen the core of iron forged in years of quiet, suffering, and relentless pragmatism. He wanted her to die. She sat up. The movement was sudden, violent. She would not. A moment of white-hot clarity descended. It was a choice, to be a victim or to be a survivor, to lie in this bed and rot or to get up and fight. The house was a predator, yes, but she was not prey, not anymore. She stood up, her body trembling with a mixture of cold and rage. She looked around the cavernous, funereal room. This was not her tomb. This was her battlefield. Her gaze fell upon the fireplace, with its mountain of cold ash. A fire. That was the first step. Warmth. Life. She went to the hearth. There was no wood, no kindling. Of course not. Why provide the tools for survival to someone you expected to die? She looked around the room. Her eyes lit on a small, rickety-looking chair in the corner, its brocade seat eaten by moths. Without a second thought, she picked it up. It was heavier than it looked. With a grunt of effort, she brought it down against the stone hearth. The wood splintered with a satisfying crack. She smashed it again and again, breaking the legs and the back into manageable pieces. Her hands were raw, splinters embedded in her palms, but she barely felt it. She was fueled by a furious energy she had not felt in years. She knelt before the fireplace, using a dry corner of the velvet bed hanging as tinder and a flint and steel she found in a small box on the mantelpiece. A forgotten relic from a time when this room was lived in. She began to strike. Sparks flew, feeble at first. Her hand was shaking so badly she could barely hold the flint. But she persisted, her jaw set, her eyes narrowed in concentration. Again and again, she struck, the sharp click of steel on stone the only sound in the room. Section, and then a spark caught. A tiny, fragile ember glowed in the dusty velvet. She blew on it, gently, carefully, nurturing it. A thin curl of smoke rose, then a tiny, hesitant flame. She fed it splinters of the broken chair, small at first, then larger pieces. The flames grew, licking at the dry wood, fragile and yet defiant. They cast a warm, dancing light across the room, pushing back the shadows, fighting the oppressive gloom. Warmth began to radiate from the hearth, a blessed, living warmth that felt like a miracle. Alara sat back on her heels, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her body aching. She was covered in dust and grime. Her hands were bleeding, but a fierce, triumphant smile touched her lips. She had made a fire. In the heart of the tomb, she had kindled a spark of life. It was a beginning. It was a declaration of war. The next morning, Alara awoke to the unfamiliar sensation of warmth. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, but it had kept the worst of the room's mortal chill at bay. Her body ached, and her throat was raw, but the suffocating despair of the previous day was gone, burned away in the fire she had made from the room's own furniture. She was stiff, she was sore, but she was alive. And she was angry. A tray had been left outside her door, a meager breakfast of thin gruel and watery tea. It was another insult, a meal fit for an invalid. She ate it, every last spoonful. It was fuel. She needed her strength. After she had eaten, she did not get back into the massive, morbid bed. Instead, she walked to the window and, with considerable effort, forced it open. The hinges shrieked in protest. A blast of cold, salt-laden air filled the room, smelling not of decay, but of the sea and the rain-washed earth. It was a clean smell, a living smell. She breathed it in deeply. She spent the morning exploring, not the grand, dead spaces of the house, but the functional ones. She found her way down to the kitchens. They were vast, stone-flagged rooms, but unlike the rest of the house, they were warm. A huge iron range was lit, and a pot of something simmered, sending a savory steam into the air. A handful of servants, a cook, a kitchen maid, a scullery boy, moved about their tasks in a kind of sullen lethargy. They stopped and stared as she entered, their expressions a mixture of surprise and suspicion. Mistress Croft was there, of course, presiding over her domain. She stood, hands on her hips, her face a thundercloud. "The kitchens are not a place for the lady of the house," she said, her voice sharp. "I'm the lady of a house that is rotting around my ears," Elara replied, her voice cool and even. She walked past the housekeeper and went straight to the cook, a stout woman with flour on her apron and a resentful look in her eye. "My name is Elara. I am a duchess. What is your name?" The cook blinked, taken aback. "Martha, your grace." "Martha," Elara said, a hint of a smile touching her lips. "That gruel you sent me for breakfast was an abomination. From now on, I will take my meals in here with the staff, and I will eat what you eat." A stunned silence fell over the kitchen. Martha's jaw dropped. Mistress Croft's face went from thunderous to apoplectic. This was not how a duchess was supposed to behave. This was not the behavior of a dying invalid. "That is highly improper," the housekeeper sputtered. "This entire situation is improper," Elara shot back, turning to face her. "I have been abandoned in a mausoleum and left in the care of a staff who clearly wish me dead. Do not speak to me of propriety, Mistress Croft. Speak to me of why there is no wood for the fireplaces in the inhabited rooms." "The Duke's orders," the housekeeper said, falling back on her one source of authority. "He wished to conserve resources. Unnecessary expenditures were to be avoided. My warmth, it seems, is an unnecessary expenditure," Elara said, her voice dangerously soft. "Very well. Then we shall have to find other ways to be practical." She turned and left the kitchen, leaving a trail of shocked silence in her wake. Her next stop was the estate office. It was a small, dusty room she found behind the buttery, its desk buried under a mountain of ledgers, all of them coated in a thick layer of dust. This, she knew, was the heart of the matter. The house was not just decaying, it was bankrupt. The Duke's order to conserve resources was not cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was a reflection of a deeper rot. She sat down at the desk, pulled the topmost ledger towards her, and blew a cloud of dust from its cover. She opened it. The pages were filled with a spidery script, detailing years of expenses and dwindling incomes. For the rest of the day, and for many days after, this was where she lived. She stopped being a duchess. She stopped being an invalid. She became an accountant. She worked with a fierce, single-minded focus. She traced the slow, steady bleeding of the estate's finances. The tenant farms were unproductive, their rents decades in arrears. The home farm was fallow. The fishing rights were leased for a pittance. The house itself was a gaping wound, hemorrhaging money on taxes for land that produced nothing and on repairs that were never made. It was a picture of catastrophic neglect. Her husband had not just abandoned her. He had abandoned this entire place, leaving it to die just as he had left her. The anger that had sustained her began to cool, replaced by a cold, clear-eyed pragmatism. This was not a battle of wills anymore. It was a problem of logistics, a puzzle to be solved. And Alara, who had spent her life making something from nothing, was very good at puzzles. Her first command was shocking in its audacity. She summoned Mr. Croft, the old groundsman who had opened the gates, a man as weathered and stooped as the ancient trees he tended. She found him in a potting shed that smelled of damp earth and old leather, sharpening a spade. He looked at her with wary, faded blue eyes. "Mr. Croft," she said without preamble, "I want you to board up the West Wing. All of it. And the North Gallery. And the state apartments. I want every room that is not the kitchens, the servant quarters, and my own suite sealed shut." The old man stared at her as if she had grown a second head. "Board them up, Your Grace. We cannot afford to heat them. We cannot afford to repair them. They are a drain we cannot sustain. We will shrink the house. We will live in the parts that are still sound. The rest, we will let go." He continued to stare, his mouth slightly agape. Then, a slow, grudging respect began to dawn in his eyes. He had lived his whole life watching this place die by inches. This was the first sensible thing he had heard anyone say in 30 years. "Aye, Your Grace," he said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "That I can do." He became her first ally. He saw not a fragile duchess, but a practical mind. He showed her which parts of the roof were soundest, which timbers were still good. Together, they mapped out a smaller, defensible version of the house, a fortress within the ruin. Her next move was to tackle the finances. She wrote letters. Her handwriting, once delicate and ornamental, became sharp and efficient. She wrote to the tenants, not with threats, but with proposals. She offered to forgive their back rent in exchange for a share of their future crops. She offered to supply seed, purchased with the last of her own meager dowry, which her uncle had, to his credit, passed on to her. She proposed they work the fallow home farm together, for a mutual share of the profits. She wrote to the merchants in the nearby town, renegotiating the pitiful price for the estate's fishing rights. She sold off assets, rotting furniture from the sealed wings, tarnished silver, a collection of dreary landscape paintings. She was ruthless. She was unsentimental. She was stripping the carcass of Blackwood Manor for everything it was worth, not to enrich herself, but to give it a chance to live. Slowly, miraculously, things began to change. Mr. Croft and a few of the younger footmen, inspired by this sudden flurry of purposeful activity, began the work of sealing the dead parts of the house. The sound of hammers echoed in the long, silent halls, a sound of construction, not decay. The tenants, suspicious at first, began to respond. A few of them, then more, agreed to her terms. Pockets of the neglected land began to be plowed. In the house, the atmosphere shifted. Alara had moved her own quarters. She had abandoned the grand, funereal bedroom and taken over a small suite of rooms near the kitchens. A parlor, a bedroom, and a small antechamber she converted into her office. The rooms were small, but she kept a fire burning day and night. She filled the parlor with books from the abandoned library, and with herbs she began to grow in pots on the windowsill. The scent of rosemary and thyme began to mingle with the smell of wood smoke and baking bread from the kitchens, pushing back the cloying scent of mildew. The staff, who had been waiting for her to die, found themselves with a mistress who worked harder than any of them. She was up before dawn, poring over the ledgers. She spent her days tramping through the muddy fields with Mr. Croft, her fine dresses ruined, her face smudged with dirt. She spent her evenings in the kitchen, learning from Martha how to bake bread, how to salt fish, how to make a little go a long way. Mistress Croft remained a bastion of hostile disapproval, but her authority was eroding. The other servants, seeing the house slowly coming back to life, seeing food on the table and purpose in their days, began to shift their loyalty. They stopped calling her the Duchess with a sneer. They started calling her Her Grace with a grudging respect. Then, simply, the mistress. She was no longer a ghost haunting their halls. She was the heart of the house, pumping life back into its sclerotic veins. One afternoon, 6 months after her arrival, Alara was in her office, her fingers stained with ink, her hair escaping its pins, a smudge of flour on her cheek. She was reconciling the accounts for the first small harvest from the home farm. The numbers were small, pitifully so, but they were black, not red. It was a profit, a tiny, fragile, miraculous profit. She leaned back in her chair, a wave of exhaustion and satisfaction washing over her. She looked out the window. The relentless rain had given way to a pale, watery sunlight. In the distance, she could see a field, newly plowed, a patch of rich, dark earth against the bleak green of the marsh. It was a scar of hope on the face of despair. She had come here to die. Instead, she had found something to live for. She had taken a tomb and begun to turn it into a home. It was a small kingdom built of mud and pragmatism and sheer, bloody-minded will. And it was hers. Alistair rode south. The war in his head had not ended with the ceasefire on the continent. It had simply changed its terrain. The clamor of cannon and the screams of men had been replaced by the drone of politicians and the endless, whispering rustle of paper. He had spent the last 2 years in the north, on the Scottish border, quelling a rebellion that was more about poverty than politics. He had done his duty. He had been ruthless, efficient, and successful. He had negotiated, threatened, and, when necessary, burned. He had secured the border for the crown, and it had hollowed him out completely. The journey back to London was a blur of gray roads and gray skies. He was bone-weary, a deep, cellular exhaustion that sleep could not touch. The ghosts of the men he had ordered to their deaths rode with him, their silent accusations a constant weight on his shoulders. He had no desire to return to the gilded cage of London society, to the endless round of balls and dinners, the sycophantic smiles, and the political maneuvering. He craved silence. He craved an ending. He found himself turning his horse off the main road, heading west towards the coast. He was not sure why. It was an instinct, a pull towards the bleakest, most desolate corner of his own vast holdings, towards Blackwood Manor. He had not thought of the place or the woman he had sent there in almost 2 years. He had expected to receive a letter, of course, a letter with a black edge, informing him that the unfortunate Duchess had succumbed to her illness. The letter had never come. He had assumed it was an oversight, that the news had simply been lost in the chaos of his work on the border. It had not occurred to him, not once, that she might still be alive. As he drew closer to the coast, the landscape began to feel familiar. The salt tang in the air, the cry of gulls, the vast, empty sky. He had forgotten how profoundly desolate this place was. He felt a grim satisfaction. This was what he needed, a place as empty as he was, a place to be quiet, a place to let the ghosts have their say. He expected to find the manor as he had left it, a rotting carcass sinking into the marsh. He expected to have to break down the gates himself. He was, therefore, unprepared for the first sign that something was wrong. The main gates, which had been rusted shut, now stood slightly ajar. The rust was still there, but the hinges had been oiled. The thicket of weeds and thorns that had choked the entrance had been cleared away. It was a small thing, but it was jarring. It was a note of order in a symphony of decay. He pushed the gate open and rode through. The drive was still rough, but the worst of the weeds had been pulled, the overhanging branches from the skeletal trees trimmed back. It was not manicured, but it was managed. And then he saw the house. He reined in his horse, his heart giving a sudden, hard jolt in his chest. From a distance, it still looked like a ruin. But as he drew closer, he saw the changes. The ivy had not been stripped away, but had been tamed, cut back from the windows and the roofline, giving the impression not of a parasite, but of a mantle of green. Many of the windows were still boarded, yes, but the ones on the ground floor, in the wing that housed the kitchens and servants' quarters, were clean. The glass glinted in the weak afternoon sun. And from 3 of the chimneys, thin plumes of smoke rose into the gray air. Wood smoke. The smell of it, clean and sharp, cut through the familiar scent of damp and decay. It was the smell of life, of a hearth, of a home. Alistair felt a profound and unsettling sense of dislocation. This was not the tomb he had left behind. This was something else. He urged his horse forward, a knot of confusion and a strange, unidentifiable apprehension tightening in his gut. As he reached the front of the house, a man came around the corner, leading a donkey laden with sacks of flour. It was Croft, the old groundsman, but he looked different. He stood straighter. The shuffling, defeated air was gone. He saw Alistair and stopped, his expression not of fearful deference, but of wary appraisal. "Your Grace," he said, his voice firm. He did not bow or scrape. He just stood there, his hand on the donkey's bridle, waiting. "Croft," Alistair said, his own voice sounding rough in his ears. "What is this? What has happened here?" Croft's weathered face creased into a wry expression. "Life, Your Grace. The mistress, she decided we ought to try living in the house, instead of just dying in it. The mistress." The words hung in the air. His wife. The pale, dying girl. The ghost. Before Alistair could form another question, the main doors of the house opened. But it was not the grand, funereal doors of the state entrance. It was a smaller, more practical door to one side, a door that led, he knew, to the warren of service corridors behind the main hall. A woman stood there, silhouetted against the dim light of the hall. She was not the woman he remembered. The woman he remembered was a fragile specter in washed-out gray. This woman was solid. She wore a simple, dark wool dress, practical and unadorned. Her sleeves were rolled up to her elbows, her forearms smudged with what looked like ink. Her pale hair was not neatly coiffed, but twisted up in a loose, untidy knot from which several strands had escaped to curl around her face. There was a smudge of dirt on her cheek. She was not beautiful, not in the way the women of London were beautiful. There was no artifice to her, no delicate fragility. Her paleness was not the pallor of sickness, but the fairness of a woman who spent her time indoors, not in a sickbed, but at a desk. She looked strong. She looked capable. She looked magnificent. She stepped out into the courtyard, her eyes narrowing against the light. She saw him sitting on his horse, and she stopped. Her expression did not change. There was no shock, no fear, no joy. There was only a cool, quiet assessment. Alistair stared at her, his mind struggling to reconcile the memory with the reality. He had left a dying wraith. He had returned to find a queen in her fortress. He swung himself down from his horse, his legs feeling unsteady. He walked towards her, the mud sucking at his boots. He stopped a few feet from her. He could see her more clearly now. The lucid green eyes were the same, but they were no longer empty. They were sharp, intelligent, and wary. They held the cool, calculating gaze of a person who is accustomed to being in charge. He did not know what to say. The world had tilted on its axis. He had come here seeking a grave, a final silence. He had found a thriving, breathing world that he did not recognize, presided over by a woman who was supposed to be dead. He fell back on the only thing he could think of, a blunt statement of fact that sounded absurd even as he said it. "You're alive." Alara looked at the man before her. The Duke of Blackwood. He was more of a ruin than she remembered. The 2 years had carved new lines on his face, deeper shadows under his eyes. The emptiness in them was still there, but now it was frayed at the edges with a raw, visible exhaustion. He looked like a man who had been flayed, stripped down to the bone by duty and despair. He was covered in the dust and mud of a long journey, his fine coat spattered, his boots worn. He looked less like a duke and more like a fugitive. He had said she was alive. The accusation in his tone was unmistakable. It was an inconvenience, a complication in his tidy plan for her demise. The old anger, the one that had sustained her through that first terrible winter, flickered in her chest. But it was a cool flame now, not a raging inferno. It was the anger of a ruler whose domain has been unexpectedly breached. She gave him a cool, level look. A small, ironic smile played on her lips. "I apologize for the inconvenience," she said, her voice dripping with a dry, cutting sarcasm that she had perfected over 2 years of negotiating with stubborn tenants and hostile merchants. Alistair flinched as if she had struck him. The response was so far from what he might have anticipated, if he had been capable of anticipating anything in that moment, that it left him speechless. He had expected tears, or accusations, or at the very least, shock. He had not expected a wit as sharp and cold as a shard of ice. "I did not expect this," he managed, the words feeling clumsy and inadequate. He gestured vaguely at the house, at the smoking chimneys, at her. "All of this?" "No," she agreed, her voice devoid of any emotion. "You expected a ruin. You expected a grave. You expected, I believe, a black-edged letter." She took a step closer, and he was struck again by the sheer, unexpected vitality of her. She was not cowed by him. She was not impressed by him. She was appraising him. "As you can see, I have been remiss in my duties. I failed to die on schedule. It has thrown the accounts into disarray." The cynical understatement was another blow. He felt a muscle twitch in his jaw. He was the Duke. He was the master of this house. And yet, he felt like an intruder. A clumsy, oafish trespasser in a finely tuned world that he did not understand. Croft was still standing by the donkey, watching them, his expression one of open loyalty to her. "What have you done here?" Alistair asked, his voice low and laced with a frustration he did not understand. "What was necessary," she replied simply. "I found a ship that was sinking, so I patched the holes. I found fallow ground, so I planted it. I found a house that was dying, so I taught it how to breathe again." She looked him up and down, her gaze missing nothing, the weariness, the dirt, the haunted look in his eyes. "You, on the other hand, look as if you have been sleeping in ditches. Did you lose a war, Your Grace? Or did you merely misplace your valet?" The sheer audacity of it stole his breath. No one spoke to him this way. No one had ever dared. He should have been furious. He should have put her in her place, reminded her of who she was, of who he was. But the anger wouldn't come. All he felt was a dizzying sense of confusion, and something else, something he could not name. A grudging, bewildered respect. "I require a room," he said, falling back on the tone of command that had served him his entire life. It sounded hollow, even to his own ears. Alara's eyebrows rose. "A room? Here? I was under the impression you were not returning. My plans have changed." "So it would seem," she said dryly. She turned to Croft. "Mr. Croft, would you be so good as to show His Grace to the old steward's quarters in the East Wing? The roof, I believe, only leaks in 2 places in that room. And perhaps you could find him some bread and cheese. The kitchens are rather busy at the moment." She turned back to Alistair. "I trust that will be satisfactory. We are, as you once so wisely advised, conserving resources. The state apartments are, I'm afraid, uninhabitable." She was dismissing him. She was assigning him to a servant's room and offering him bread and cheese, as if he were a weary traveler seeking shelter, not the master of the house. The power dynamic had shifted so completely it was vertiginous. He was an outsider here. His title meant nothing. The only authority that mattered in this place was hers. The authority she had earned. Without another word, she turned and went back inside, the door closing firmly behind her. Alistair was left standing in the courtyard, mud on his boots, exhaustion weighing him down like a shroud, staring at the closed door. Croft came forward, his expression carefully neutral. "This way, Your Grace," the old man said, his voice respectful but not subservient. Alistair followed him, his mind reeling. He had come home to die. He had found, instead, that his tomb was fiercely, stubbornly, and inconveniently alive, and he had no idea what to do. The days that followed were a study in surreal displacement for Alistair. He was a ghost in his own house, a stranger in a land he nominally ruled. The steward's room he was given was small, sparsely furnished, and cold. It was, however, clean, and the roof, as Alara had promised, only leaked in 2 places, the drips collected neatly in a pair of buckets. He was brought plain, wholesome food, thick bread, sharp cheese, a hearty stew, by a young maid who looked at him with wide, curious eyes, but said nothing. He watched the life of the house from a distance, a bewildered spectator. The place was a hive of quiet, purposeful activity. He saw Alara striding across the muddy yard in heavy boots, deep in conversation with Croft. He saw her in the kitchen, her sleeves rolled up, kneading dough alongside Martha the cook. He saw her through the window of her small office, bent over her ledgers late into the night, a single candle burning, her face a mask of intense concentration. She ran the estate not like a duchess, but like a quartermaster. Everything was practical, efficient, stripped of all sentimentality. The grand, decaying state rooms remained sealed, monuments to a forgotten era of profligacy. The life of the house was concentrated in the functional spaces, the kitchens, the workshops, the few warm rooms she had claimed from the ruin. It was a fortress, a siege camp, and she was its undisputed commander. He was an intruder in her system. His presence was a disruption. The servants, who had long forgotten him, treated him with a wary, formal politeness, but it was clear their loyalty was to her. When he tried to give an order, a request for his horse to be saddled, the stable boy looked at him blankly and said, "I'll have to ask the mistress." The humiliation was a dull, constant ache. He was the Duke of Blackwood. His name held power across the country. But here, in this small, damp corner of his own world, he was irrelevant. He had no role, no purpose. He had come here seeking oblivion, and he had found something far more unsettling. A world that had learned to exist without him. A world that was, in fact, thriving because of his absence. He and Alara rarely spoke. They would pass in a corridor or in the yard, and she would incline her head with a cool, formal nod, her green eyes giving nothing away. The sarcasm of their first encounter had been replaced by a polite, impenetrable distance. She was treating him like a guest. An unwelcome one, perhaps, but a guest nonetheless. One evening, unable to bear the confines of his small room, he went in search of the library. He found it in one of the sealed-off wings, the door unlocked but grimed with dust. The air inside was freezing, thick with the smell of old paper and decay. Moonlight streamed through a grimy arched window, illuminating a scene of breathtaking neglect. Books lay in moldering piles on the floor, their bindings warped and broken. The shelves were collapsing, and a fine layer of greenish mold covered everything. He ran a hand over a leather-bound volume, and the leather flaked away under his touch. This was his family's history, his legacy, rotting away into dust. This was the result of his neglect, of his family's neglect for generations. He had been so consumed with the grand duties of the dukedom, the wars, the politics, the fate of the nation, that he had let his own home, the very heart of his inheritance, crumble. A sound from the doorway made him turn. Alara stood there, holding a candle. Her light cast a small, warm pool in the vast, cold darkness of the room. She was wrapped in a heavy shawl, her face pale in the flickering light. "I thought I might find you here," she said. Her voice was quiet, without its usual sharp edge. A connoisseur of ruins. "This was once the finest private library in the North," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he could not name. "My grandfather spent a fortune on it. A fortune that might have been better spent mending the roof," she replied, but there was no bite in the words. It was a simple statement of fact. She walked into the room, her candle held high. "I came through here when I first arrived. I took what I could save. The books on agriculture, on animal husbandry, on architecture. The practical ones. The rest." She gestured to the decaying piles. The poetry and the philosophy, they did not seem as urgent. "You saved the ledgers, but let the poets rot," he said, a bitter smile twisting his lips. "Poetry doesn't teach you how to make a field grow grain in salty soil," she said, "or how to renegotiate a fishing lease. I did what was necessary to survive. You, of all people, should understand that." He looked at her, truly looked at her, in the wavering candlelight. He saw the faint lines of exhaustion around her eyes, the stark intelligence in her face. He saw the woman who had faced a tomb and refused to lie down in it. "I sent you here to die," he said, the words a raw confession, torn from some deep, buried part of him. "I know," she said. She did not flinch. Her gaze remained steady. "It was a logical, if unkind, solution to your problem. I held no illusions about our arrangement. And you do not hate me for it?" The question surprised him. He did not know why he was asking it. He did not know why her answer suddenly seemed to matter. Alara was silent for a long moment, her gaze moving over the decaying books, the crumbling shelves. "Hate is a luxury," she said finally, her voice soft. "It requires energy. I had none to spare. All my energy was spent on staying warm, on finding food, on fighting this house." She looked back at him, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of something other than cool pragmatism in her eyes. It was a deep, profound weariness that mirrored his own. "I did not have time to hate you. I was too busy cleaning up your mess." The truth of her words hit him with the force of a physical blow. His mess, this ruin, this decay, this slow, creeping death, it was all his. He had been so focused on the grand stage, on the fate of empires, that he had been blind to the rot in his own backyard. He had abandoned his home, his people, his responsibilities. And this woman, this ghost he had tried to discard, had taken it upon herself to shoulder the burden he had shrugged off. He had no answer for her. The silence and the cold, dark library stretched between them, thick with unspoken things. He, the great duke, the warrior, the statesman, felt small and useless in the face of her quiet, relentless competence. He had broken things. She had fixed them. It was as simple and as damning as that. The first winter storms rolled in off the North Sea, battering the coast with a savage, relentless fury. The wind howled around the stone corners of Blackwood Manor, a mournful, shrieking chorus that seemed to worm its way through the very walls. Rain, driven almost horizontal, lashed against the windows. The sea, a churning cauldron of gray and white, crashed against the shore, its roar a constant, threatening thunder. The fortress Alara had built was being put to the test. She had prepared for it. The larders were stocked with salted fish and preserved vegetables. The woodsheds were piled high with logs cut from the deadfall in the neglected woods. The weak points in the roof had been patched, the windows caulked. But the ferocity of the storm was beyond anything they had anticipated. It was a physical assault, an attempt by the wild, untamed nature of the place to reclaim what had been stolen from it. The crisis came on the third night of the storm. A section of the roof over the kitchens, a part they had thought secure, gave way under the relentless pounding of the wind and rain. Water began to pour into the heart of the house, cascading down the walls, flooding the stone floor. The kitchen, the warm, beating heart of their small community, was being drowned. Alara was there in an instant, roused from her sleep by the panicked shouts of the kitchen maid. She arrived to a scene of chaos. Servants were running back and forth with buckets, their efforts futile against the deluge. The fire in the great range was hissing and sputtering as water dripped onto it. Martha, the cook, stood in the middle of the room, her face a mask of despair as the water swirled around her ankles. Alara began shouting orders, her voice sharp and clear above the roar of the storm. "Get sacks. Anything. We need to divert the water. Croft, get them in. We need to get onto the roof." But even as she spoke, she knew it was a losing battle. The wind was too strong, the rain too heavy. No one could survive on the roof in this tempest. The house, which she had fought so hard to save, was being broken by a force she could not command. A feeling of helpless, sickening despair began to creep over her. She had worked so hard. She had fought so long. And it was all going to be washed away. It was in that moment of chaos and despair that Alistair appeared. He seemed to come from nowhere, a tall, dark shape in the flickering lamplight. He had thrown a heavy coat over his shirt. His hair was disheveled, but his eyes were clear and focused. He took in the scene in a single, sweeping glance. The flooding, the panicked servants, the look of defeat on Alara's face. He did not speak to her. He did not ask for permission. He acted. "You!" he roared, his voice a parade ground command that cut through the noise like a cannon shot. He pointed at two of the young footmen who were aimlessly sloshing buckets. "With me. Croft, get ropes. And tarpaulins from the stable. Now!" The servants, who had been ignoring him for weeks, snapped to attention, their military training, or lack thereof, responding to a voice that expected and received absolute obedience. The ingrained deference to his title, long dormant, flared back to life in the face of crisis. He was the Duke. He was the commander. "Your Grace, you can't go up there," Croft protested, gesturing to the groaning ceiling. "It's not safe. The wind will take you." "It will be less safe when the entire roof comes down and crushes us," Alistair shot back, his face grim. "We cover the hole. We divert the water. We save the house." He turned to Alara, and for the first time, he looked at her not as a stranger or an inconvenience, but as a fellow officer in a desperate battle. "Keep the fire lit," he commanded. "If it goes out, we lose everything." And then he was gone, plunging into the storm with the two footmen at his heels, a coil of rope slung over his shoulder. Alara stood frozen for a moment, stunned. He had taken command. He had, in the space of 10 seconds, organized a response that was more effective than anything she had managed. And he had given her an order: keep the fire lit. He had recognized the strategic importance of the kitchen hearth, not just for warmth, but for morale. He had seen her battlefield and understood its stakes. The moment of paralysis passed. He had given her a job, a vital one. She turned to Martha, her voice ringing with a new authority, an authority that was not just her own, but was now backed by his. "Martha, get the big copper pots. We need to shield the range. Everyone else, stop bailing. For a line, pass the sacks to the west wall. We're building a dam." The next few hours were a blur of frantic, desperate work. Alara and the remaining servants worked inside, fighting a frantic battle against the rising water. They built a makeshift wall of sacks, diverting the flood away from the precious range and towards a drain in the scullery. They worked in ankle-deep, freezing water, their hands raw, their bodies aching, but they worked with a new sense of purpose, a new hope. Above them, they could hear the roar of the wind, punctuated by the shouts of the men on the roof and the frantic flapping of canvas. It sounded like a battle, a desperate, impossible fight against the elements. Alara found herself praying, not to God. She had long since abandoned that, but to the grim, haunted man who was at that moment fighting for her home on the storm-lashed roof. She had thought him a ruin, a husk, but in the heart of the storm, she had seen something else. The warrior, the leader, the man who knew how to fight a losing battle and, perhaps, how to win one. Just before dawn, as the storm began to abate, they returned. Alistair entered the kitchen first, drenched to the skin, his face streaked with grime, a bloody gash on his forehead where a piece of flying debris had struck him. He was followed by the two footmen, who looked exhausted but also strangely exhilarated. "It's done," Alistair said, his voice hoarse. "The tarpaulin is secure. It will hold until we can get proper repairs done." He swayed on his feet, the adrenaline that had been sustaining him finally draining away. Alara rushed to his side, her earlier animosity forgotten in a wave of overwhelming relief and gratitude. "You're hurt," she said, her voice unsteady. "It's nothing," he slurred, and then his eyes rolled back in his head, and he collapsed, a dead weight, into her arms. The aftermath of the storm was quiet. The wind had dropped to a mournful sigh, and the rain had softened to a gentle patter. The tarpaulin on the roof held, and the flood in the kitchen had been contained. The house, though battered, was still standing. It had survived. They had survived. Alara, with the help of a still awestruck Croft, had managed to get Alistair out of the chaotic kitchen and to his room. He was a dead weight, his exhaustion so profound it was like a physical manifestation. They had stripped off his soaking, muddy clothes and bundled him into his narrow bed. Alara had cleaned the gash on his forehead herself, her touch surprisingly gentle as she dabbed at the wound with a cloth soaked in warm water and herbs. He had not stirred. She sat now in a chair beside his bed in the quiet pre-dawn gloom. The small room was lit by a single candle. She watched the slow, steady rise and fall of his chest. In sleep, the harsh lines of his face were softened. The haunted look was gone, replaced by a simple, profound weariness. He looked younger. He looked vulnerable. She had spent 2 years building her fortress, her kingdom of pragmatism. She had built it on a foundation of anger and defiance towards this man. He was the enemy, the careless architect of her near demise. But tonight, he had fought for her kingdom. He had risked his life to save it. He had bled for it. The rigid category she had placed him in, the callous duke, the broken soldier, the unwelcome guest, were dissolving. She did not know what to make of the man who lay unconscious in the bed before her. He was a contradiction, a man capable of both profound neglect and profound courage. A tremor ran through his body, and he muttered something in his sleep, a name or a place she could not understand. His hand, which lay on top of the rough blanket, clenched into a fist. He was still fighting his wars, even in sleep. Without thinking, she reached out and laid her hand over his. His skin was cold, but there was a strength in his grip, even in unconsciousness. The contact was grounding. It was not romantic. It was not sentimental. It was the simple, physical acknowledgement of a shared struggle. Two survivors, clinging to the same piece of wreckage in a stormy sea. She sat there for a long time, her hand covering his, listening to the sound of his breathing and the gentle patter of the rain. The silence between them was no longer a weapon. It was something else, a space for a new, fragile understanding to take root. When he finally awoke, the sun was a weak, watery presence in the sky. He felt a dull, pounding ache in his head and a deeper, more pervasive ache in every muscle of his body. He opened his eyes. The first thing he saw was her. She was asleep in the chair beside his bed, her head slumped at an awkward angle, her face pale with exhaustion. The heavy shawl had slipped from her shoulders. She looked small and fragile in the gray morning light. But he knew better now. She was as fragile as forged steel. He remembered the storm, the chaos, the roar of the wind. He remembered the look on her face when the roof gave way. Not fear, but the grim despair of a general watching her lines break. He remembered climbing onto the roof, the wind trying to tear him from his purchase, the rain blinding him. He remembered the fierce, desperate joy of the fight, the simple, clear purpose of it. Save the house. He had not felt that kind of clarity in years. Not in the endless, muddy campaigns on the continent. Not in the cynical political battles in the north. Those had been duties, burdens he had shouldered because he must. But last night had been different. He had not been fighting for the crown, or for his title, or for his honor. He had been fighting for this strange, stubborn woman and the small, defiant world she had built from his ruins. He had been fighting for a home. She stirred, her eyes fluttering open. They were cloudy with sleep for a moment, then they focused on him. They were clear, green, and completely unreadable. "You're awake," she said. Her voice was husky with sleep. "So it would seem," he replied, his own voice a rough croak. He tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness washed over him, and he sank back against the pillows with a groan. "Don't," she said, her voice sharp with a command that was now familiar. "You have a concussion, and you're exhausted. Lie still." She stood up and walked to a small table where a jug of water and a cup sat. She poured a cup and brought it to him, holding it to his lips. "Drink." He drank, the cool water a balm to his parched throat. He watched her as she took the cup away. She moved with a quiet efficiency, her every gesture purposeful. She was not playing the role of a nurse. She was simply taking care of him. It was a practical, unsentimental act of care, like mending a roof or balancing a ledger. And it was, for him, a profoundly alien experience. No one had taken care of him since he was a boy. He was the Duke. He was the one who took care of others, who bore the burdens, who made the hard decisions. To be the recipient of such simple, uncomplicated care was deeply unsettling and deeply comforting. The roof held, he said, the words a statement, not question. "Yes," she said, turning back to face him. "The tarpaulin is holding. Croft says the main timbers are sound. We were lucky." "It wasn't luck," he said quietly. "It was you. You'd already done the work. You'd made the house strong enough to withstand the first blow." A faint flush rose on her cheeks, the first sign of color he had seen in them that was not from fever or anger. "We did what was necessary," she said, deflecting the praise. They fell silent. The air in the small room was thick with unspoken things. The shared crisis had broken down the walls between them, leaving them in a new, uncharted territory. The old roles, the callous duke, the abandoned wife, no longer fit. They were simply a man and a woman, both exhausted, both survivors, in a quiet room at the edge of the world. "Why did you do it?" Alara asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why did you go up on that roof? You could have been killed." Alistair looked at her. He thought of all the reasons he could give her. Duty, responsibility, the protection of his property. They were all true, in their way. But they were not the real reason. The real reason was something far more complicated, something he was only just beginning to understand himself. "I don't know," he said, and it was the most honest thing he had said in years. He looked around the small, bare room. He looked at her tired, intelligent face. "When I came back here, I was looking for an ending, for a quiet place to stop. I found this instead." He met her gaze. "You built a world here, Alara. A small, stubborn, living world. I think I wanted to be a part of it, even for a night." The use of her first name, the raw confession in his voice, changed the atmosphere in the room completely. The last of her defenses, the cool, sarcastic armor she had worn for 2 years, began to crumble. She saw the man behind the duke, the broken, weary man who had come home seeking a grave and had stumbled into a life instead. She pulled the chair closer to the bed and sat down. She did not take his hand this time. She just sat there, a quiet, steady presence in the room. "Rest, Alistair," she said softly, using his name for the first time. "The storm is over." And for the first time in a very long time, he believed it might be. He closed his eyes and let sleep, a true, healing sleep, finally claim him. In the weeks that followed the great storm, a fragile truce settled over Blackwood Manor. It was a truce born not of words, but of shared labor. The house needed to be repaired, and the work became the bridge across the chasm of their past. Alistair, once he had recovered his strength, did not retreat into the role of the aloof duke. Instead, he threw himself into the practical, physical work of rebuilding. He was surprisingly adept. The years of military campaigning had taught him engineering, logistics, and how to work with his hands. He and Croft spent their days on the roofs, replacing damaged slates, securing timbers, making the house truly watertight for the first time in a generation. He worked alongside the tenants in the fields, his fine gentleman's hands growing calloused, his face and arms browned by the wind and sun. He was no longer a ghost haunting the corridors. He was a physical presence, a force of constructive energy. Alara watched him, her initial wariness slowly giving way to a grudging admiration, which in turn softened into something she was not yet ready to name. She continued to manage her side of the world. The ledgers, the supplies, the careful diplomacy with merchants and tenants. But now it was different. They were partners. They began to talk, not about the past, that was still a minefield, but about the present. They would meet in her small office in the evenings, the room filled with the scent of wood smoke and old paper. She would have the ledgers spread out on the desk, and he would stand over her shoulder, looking at the columns of figures. Section dash, the yield from a north field was better than we expected, she would say, pointing a slender, ink-stained finger at a number. If we invest in more drainage tiles, I think we can double it next year. We'll need to reinforce the seawall first, he would counter, his voice a low rumble. Another storm like the last one, and we'll lose that entire field to the sea. They would argue, their debates sharp and focused, but there was no animosity in them. It was the passionate, pragmatic debate of two people utterly invested in the same goal, the survival and prosperity of Blackwood. He brought his knowledge of the world, of engineering, of large-scale strategy. She brought her intimate knowledge of the land, her genius for logistics, and her unwavering pragmatism. Together, they were formidable. One afternoon, they were in the stables, inspecting a new mare Croft had purchased at a nearby fair. The mare was skittish, her eyes rolling nervously. Alistair approached her slowly, speaking in a low, soothing voice. He reached out a hand and stroked her neck, his touch firm and confident. The horse, sensing his calm strength, quieted, leaning into his touch. Alara watched him, a strange tightness in her chest. She had seen him as a force of destruction, then as a force of command. Now she was seeing something else, a capacity for gentleness, for quiet connection. He turned and saw her watching him. He smiled, a rare, genuine smile that transformed his harsh face, erasing some of the weariness from his eyes. "She just needs to know she's safe," he said. The words hung in the air between them, freighted with a double meaning. He was not just talking about the horse. He was talking about them, about this place. Later that day, a moment of physical contact occurred that was as unexpected as it was profound. They were in the newly repaired kitchen garden, a space Alara had carved from a patch of wasteland behind the house. She was on her knees, her hands deep in the rich, dark earth, planting garlic cloves for the winter. A sudden gust of wind blew a loose strand of hair across her face. Without thinking, Alistair, who was kneeling beside her, reached out and gently tucked the strand behind her ear. His fingers brushed against her cheek. The touch was brief, almost accidental, but it sent a jolt through her, a warmth that had nothing to do with the weak afternoon sun. His hand was rough, callous from his work, but his touch was incredibly gentle. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. He froze too, his hand hovering near her face for a heart-stopping moment. Their eyes met. In his gaze, she saw not the empty winter sky of their first meeting, but something new, something warm and deep and uncertain. It was a look of dawning wonder, as if he were seeing her, truly seeing her for the very first time. He pulled his hand back as if he had been burned, a dark flush rising on his neck. Apologies," he stammered, the smooth, commanding Duke momentarily lost, replaced by a clumsy, uncertain man. "It's fine," she said, her own voice barely a whisper. She turned her attention back to the garlic, her heart hammering against her ribs. The silence that fell between them was different now. It was no longer comfortable or pragmatic. It was charged, filled with a tension that was both terrifying and exhilarating. The careful, practical partnership they had built had suddenly been complicated by something else, something wild and unpredictable, something that felt dangerously like hope. They worked on in silence, their shoulders occasionally brushing, each contact a small explosion of awareness. The pragmatic fortress she had built around her heart had been breached, and she found, to her profound astonishment, that she was not afraid. The fragile peace of their self-contained world was shattered by the arrival of a horseman. He was not a local farmer or a merchant from the town. He was a royal courier, his horse lathered, his uniform immaculate despite the mud on his boots. He carried a leather dispatch case bearing the king's own seal. He had come for the Duke. Alara was in the kitchen, tasting a broth with Martha, when Croft came to find her, his face grim. "A rider from London, mistress, for his grace." A cold knot of dread formed in Alara's stomach. She had known, in some corner of her mind, that this day would come. He was the Duke of Blackwood. His world was not this small, windswept patch of coast. It was the world of politics, of power, of the court. She had allowed herself to forget that. She had allowed herself to believe that this small, quiet life they had built together could last. She had been a fool. She followed Croft out into the courtyard. Alistair was already there, taking the sealed dispatch from the courier. He looked every inch the Duke again, tall, commanding, his face set in the familiar, remote mask of duty. The easy camaraderie of the past weeks, the shared labor, the quiet smiles, it all seemed to evaporate in the cold light of this new reality. He was a different man, the man who had abandoned her. He broke the seal and read the letter, his expression unreadable. Alara watched him, her heart turning to a cold, heavy stone in her chest. This was it. The old world was calling him back. He would go, of course. His duty was to the crown, to his name, to the world beyond these crumbling walls. This place, and she with it, had been nothing more than a temporary harbor, a place to refit his ship before setting sail again. The defensive wall she had so carefully dismantled slammed back into place. Her face became a cool, emotionless mask. She had been a fool to trust, a fool to hope. She had survived his first abandonment. She would survive this one. He finished reading and looked up, His eyes found hers across the courtyard. She met his gaze without flinching, her expression one of polite, formal inquiry. She was the mistress of Blackwood Manor. He was the Duke, a distinguished guest who was about to depart. She would play her part. "Your Grace received news?" she asked, her voice as cool and crisp as an autumn morning. The courier, sensing a private moment, discreetly moved away to tend to his horse. Alistair walked towards her, the dispatch held loosely in his hand. "The king requires my presence at court," he said, his voice flat. "There is a situation in France. They want my counsel." "Of course," she said, her voice perfectly even. "You must go. Your duty calls." She was proud of her composure. There was not a tremor in her voice, not a flicker of the devastation she felt. "I will have your things packed. When do you leave?" He stopped in front of her. He looked at her, at the polite, impenetrable mask she was wearing, the same mask she had worn when he had first returned. He saw that he had lost her. The fragile trust they had built had shattered. "Ilara," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Your Grace," she corrected him, her voice sharp. "If you will let me know your travel arrangements, I will see that the necessary provisions are made." She was all business now, the efficient chatelaine. She was pushing him away, retreating back into her fortress. He looked from her cold, closed face to the letter in his hand. He looked around the courtyard, at the repaired stables, at the smoke rising from the kitchen chimney, at the solid, enduring stones of the house they had saved together. He looked at the sea, a calm, blue-gray today, and at the vast, open sky. He saw his life laid out before him, the life of duty in London, a life of power and influence and profound, soul-crushing emptiness. And this life, this hard, simple, meaningful life he had found in the ruins. He had come here seeking a grave. He had found a home, a decision, clear and absolute, settled in his mind. It was not a choice between two duties. It was a choice between a life that was a lie and a life that was true. "I'm not going," he said. Ilara stared at him, her composure finally cracking. "What?" "I'm not going back to London," he repeated, his voice firm. He held up the letter. "This world, it is no longer mine. My father, my grandfather, they built an empire for the crown. They neglected their own home to do it. They left this place to rot. I will not make the same mistake." He walked to the small forge that Croft used to mend tools, where a low fire was burning. The courier watched, his mouth agape. Alistair looked at the royal seal on the dispatch, the symbol of the world that had claimed his life, his soul. And then, in a single, decisive movement, he thrust the letter into the flames. The parchment curled, blackened, and was consumed, the red wax of the royal seal melting like a drop of blood before disappearing into the fire. It was an act of treason, an act of rebellion. It was a declaration. He turned back to Ilara. Her face was a picture of stunned disbelief. The mask was gone, replaced by a raw, vulnerable shock. "My duty is no longer to the crown," he said, his voice ringing with a conviction she had never heard before. "My duty is here, to this land, to this house." He took a step closer, his eyes burning into hers. "To you." He reached out and took her hands. They were cold as ice. "When I left you here, I was a ghost, a hollow man. You, Ilara, you taught this place how to live again. And in doing so, you taught me." His voice dropped, becoming thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "I have no home in London. I have no life there. You are my home." The words, so simple, so direct, shattered the last of her defenses. The fortress she had built around her heart did not just crack. It crumbled into dust. The tears she had refused to shed for 2 years, the tears of grief, of anger, of loneliness, of hope, finally came. They streamed down her face, unchecked. She did not try to hide them. She did not try to be strong. For the first time, she allowed herself to be vulnerable. She leaned forward, her forehead resting against his chest, and wept. Alistair wrapped his arms around her, holding her tightly, protectively. He buried his face in her hair, which smelled of wood smoke and rosemary and the clean scent of the sea. He felt her tears soaking his shirt, and he felt not guilt, but a profound, overwhelming sense of rightness. He was home. They stood there for a long time in the middle of the courtyard, oblivious to the stunned courier, to the curious servants peeking from the windows. They were two broken people who had, against all odds, found a way to make each other whole. They were a permanent fixture against the coming winter, two souls intertwined, in the heart of a house that was no longer a tomb, but was fiercely, stubbornly, and completely alive. The Duke had come home, not to the grandeur of his title, but to the quiet, unassailable truth of a home he had not known he possessed, and a duchess he had finally learned to love.